Guys. We're going to look at the impact. How did the European expansion impact specifically China here? I do have a little bit of context here. I want to prove to you that China, there is reasons for their kind of retraction, and there is a reason why they're going to be impacted. And again, it's going to be moderately. We already know about Macau, which is about right there, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. Oh, I should probably did a better map, but it's okay. All right. So really quickly, I just think it's kind of amazing that the Ming Dynasty, which you see the years here, not so you have to memorize. The Ming Dynasty was one of the greatest empires the world had ever seen to this point. China had invented the printing press before Gutenberg. They invented paper. They invented the compass. They invented silk. They invented porcelain pottery. They just did some amazing things, right? And the Ming Dynasty was so important. They were so wealthy. They actually had an age of discovery 100 years before Europe. Throughout the late 1300s or the 14th century, there is evidence that China had navigators and explorers go all the way to Africa. And there is some evidence that they may have actually crossed the Pacific Ocean over 100 years before Magellan. Now, that's more extrapolation where we're kind of guessing through archaeology. But what we do know is that the Ming Dynasty by far was an expanding empire during the 1300s. Very powerful. Well, all of that is going to change. All of that is going to change when we get to the late 1600s or the 1600s. The Manchus are up here. They're a kind of a nomadic tribes. They begin to invade, and they actually will be able to go around the Great Wall. There's a couple of weaknesses there. And as the Manchus begin to invade, the Ming Dynasty absolutely ended their exploration to the point that they burned all their junks. If you don't know what a junk is, that's one of the big Chinese ships. They burned all of them, and all of their resources went from expanding to defending their borders. So, real quick, the concept of their United Nations state, which really wasn't, but their political stability is challenged. So, therefore, instead of expanding, they're going to need to do their own quote unquote reconquista. Well, they're going to have to justify it. And the Ming Dynasty, and I do want us to know this is going to be called Confucianism. Confucianism. Whoops, that's an N, sorry. Confucianism. Confucianism is a philosophy or a religion in China. And we're not going to teach the whole aspect of this because it's a very complicated aspect. But the Ming Dynasty is going to use Confucianism to justify their retreat from the globe. They according to Confucianism, this is the one plank. China is pure and perfect, and the outside world is evil. So with that, do the Ming Dynasty, do they want to connect and trade with the world? Of course not, because they believe the world has nothing for them to offer, which isn't necessarily wrong. But what they want to do is use this to justify using their resources to attack the Manchus. So this changes the paradigm. And one of the other fun facts, according to Confucianism, because the outside world's evil, do they want more or less trade? Less trade, of course. And if there's less trade, guess, according to Confucianism, who is the worst social class? If you said merchants, you are absolutely right. So if we look at it, the merchants become the lower class. Is that crazy? At the exact same time that the merchants are rising in Europe, the merchants will be seen as the lower classes and leeches on society. I do think it's an important thing to think about with the impact. Unfortunately, from the Ming Dynasty in 1644, the Manchus finally conquer. They conquer, and the Manchu dynasty turns into the Qing dynasty. And the Qing dynasty, they're not even Chinese, they're Manchus. So now they have to transform themselves into a Chinese dynasty. So they take the most extreme version of Confucianism and say, all contact with the outside world is evil. Again, really important because at the same exact time, you've already identified, we've talked about Macau. If you've done your power map, you've talked about Canton, right? Canton, which is a British or an English trade enclave. And what happens is these trade enclaves will have limited access to China. So let's talk a little bit more about that. I think it's going to be a little bit later. All right. Unfortunately for China, the decline of the Qing dynasty occurred just as Europeans were increasing pressure for more trade. I think that's such an important part. We're going to be looking at the 1700s and into the early 1800s, and there's going to be this economic push for England and the rest of Europe to connect to China. They want to trade silk, spices, porcelain, but they also want to trade European products into China because China is the largest population in the world. Well, according to Confucianism, do they want English products? Not at all. So they're going to resist. Unfortunately for the Qing dynasty, as they're beginning to decline, Europeans are going to be superior. They're going to take all of the technology they've learned 300 years ago from the Silk Road, such as gunpowder, and turn it into modern weapons. The Qing dynasty will hold on to traditional weapons. So therefore, they're not going to be prepared. I hope that makes sense to you. Hopefully that's not over your head. Now, the British East India Company is going to be the overseer of the British economy or the British colonies. And we see that. Canton, I've already located it up on the map, right? Canton is the British enclave. The British enclave is like the Portuguese enclave, Macau. So what happens in Canton? The Qing emperors allow the British to come in with only gold. They cannot bring products to buy and sell. So for 6 weeks of the year in Canton, British merchants can go into this fortified city, which they're not allowed to leave. They allow for some of the Chinese merchants to come in, and then the Chinese merchants sell them silk, spices, and porcelain in return for gold. Then, after those 6 weeks, the British are forced out of the colony. So they're only there temporarily, and they're only there to retrieve Chinese goods. The Qing emperors did not want anything from the outside world. Well, that seems cool until you begin to realize the British didn't like losing all their gold. So around 1800, Lord Macartney goes to China and he basically says, hey, we want you to open the markets. As we are coming here and unnaturally increasing your wealth, we believe we have cool products such as cotton textiles, we'll see this later, cotton textiles, and we want to sell them to your people. The emperor said, heck no. And what did Dr. Spielvogel say? This is 1800. He said, China will soon regret their decision. We'll talk more about that later, but that's going to see because the British are going to be forced themselves with their modern technology to defeat them. But now, really quickly, what I want to conclude here is China. We've developed China. We've identified Ming China and Qing China. We've identified that they're in a decline, so there's a slight power vacuum, but they're still united. The Qing dynasty, through Confucianism, justified their rule. We're pure, perfect. The rest of the world's evil, so they limit their trade. They allow for the British to trade on Canton. They allow the Portuguese to trade in Macau, but they're only able to offload gold. So therefore, the British and the Europeans are going to try to force the markets open. I hope that makes sense. And we'll talk about Japan in the next one.